So section 1.4 in your textbook is on other sampling methods. Simple random sample is the most common. There are a few other sampling methods, and we're not necessarily going to go through how to do each one of these. We'll just kind of briefly talk about what it is and some quick examples of when you would use that type of sampling. So the first kind is called stratified random sampling. In this, you separate the population into what are called strata, which are basically groups, by a common characteristic. So I might sort by age, I might sort by height, I might sort by GPA, I might sort by all kinds of different things. So you separate your population maybe by color. If you're classifying objects, you separate the population into some sort of groups by a common characteristic. That's the first thing you do. And then the second thing you do is you take a simple random sample, take an SRS from each strata, from each group. So I might separate all my objects by color and take a little bit of blue, a little bit of green, a little bit of yellow, a little bit from each group. So the examples of this is so this is used for populations that are easily sorted. It's easy to sort objects or vehicles. Sometimes it's easy to sort the animals. Sometimes it's easy to sort humans, right? We can sort easily based on how many credits we have, based on our height, based on gender, all kinds of different ways to sort us. So this is used for populations that are easily sorted. And it usually gives a pretty good sample. So I'm just going to kind of draw a picture to demonstrate how this works. I wish I had a little bit more room. So if I separate everybody into 4 groups, I'm going to take a random sample from this group, a random sample from that group, a random sample from that group, and a random sample from that group. So it's a little sample of each kind. So again, I could separate by blue, red, green, and let's say yellow, and take a little bit from each group. So that's what a stratified random sample is. Colleges use this a lot. Sometimes they'll sort students by age, and so they'll give a survey to the youngest students, and then each age group progressing along, they'll give a little survey to each age group, and then gather the data together to come up with the summary. The next type of sampling is called systematic sampling. And this is when you select every, and the textbook calls this kth individual from the population. So I might select every 5th student that walks in my classroom, or every 10th student, or every 20th student. Companies will do this at retail stores. Every 20th customer in the door gets a free gift, or every 50th customer gets a survey or gets something selected for something. So you select every so often, every kth individual from the population. So some examples are a manager, manager might survey every 10th customer that walks in the store. In this case, K would equal 10. So you might decide every 10th person, I'm going to talk to them, or I'm going to ask them a question, or I'm going to give them a free gift. Receipts do this automatically. So when you're shopping, receipts print surveys on every, and they'll decide 20th or 50th or 100th receipt, and it's automatically programmed into the register to print that survey on every 50th receipt. In that case, K would equal 50. So K can be any number. It's just a system, systematically sampling every 5th person, every 10th person. So you just keep doing that until you have however many you need in your sample. So that's called a systematic sample. And again, there's more examples of this in your textbook. Try to put the page numbers so you can go straight to those pages to get some more examples. I'm just kind of hitting the high points here. The next type of sample is called a cluster sample. In this one, you randomly select a location or a time frame. Sorry, my handwriting is a little rough today. Randomly select a location or time frame, and you survey every individual at that time or location. So, and you might have experienced this if you've taken face-to-face classes. Sometimes the dean will walk in and distribute a survey to every single person in the room. So they'll randomly select a time and location, and everybody sitting in that room at that time and location gets the survey. The key word here is every individual at that time or location gets surveyed. It's not a little sample from each location. And so in this example, if I had, let's say, 4 different classrooms or 3 different classrooms, so this, let's say this is classroom 101, 102, 103, and 104, I would randomly select one, and then everybody in that one classroom would get surveyed. Sometimes we'll do this with different times. So I might pick a time between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. and every single person I see between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. will get surveyed. That's called a cluster sample. So a dean can survey every student in a randomly chosen classroom. Sometimes they'll do this by zip code. They'll pick a zip code and they'll distribute flyers to everybody in that zip code. Sometimes you'll see flyers on your car, so they'll randomly choose a parking lot or a row in the parking lot, and every car in that row gets a flyer. That's called a cluster sample. So we're clustering everybody into one spot. So you randomly pick a spot, and then everybody gets surveyed from that spot. It's called a cluster sample. Those are the 3 main types of sampling that we're going to focus on, other than simple random, is stratified, systematic, and cluster. There's another type of sampling that happens, but it's not a good type of sampling. It's actually a bad type of sampling, and that is called convenience sampling, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on. This is when you have self-selected participation. So you've decided to take the survey on your own. This is when you have voluntary response. So I might just decide to complete the survey without being asked to. This is also considered lazy sampling. So if I was supposed to ask everybody in the room, I might just put the flyers by the door and just let whoever picks it up pick it up. Or just ask the first 5 people I see and then not worry about the rest of them. So it's kind of lazy sampling. That's why it's called convenience sampling. So it's just out of convenience or laziness, whatever's the easiest. You'll notice this a lot. Some examples are pop-up surveys on websites. They just program the survey to pop up, and whether you complete it or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of there for you. leaving comment cards on the tables. So restaurants will just kind of leave all the cards on the table, and you get to decide whether or not you want to complete the survey. So these are very unreliable results. Usually what ends up happening is if you're volunteering your response, you usually only volunteer your answer if it's bad, if you had a horrible experience. If you had an okay or a good experience, generally speaking, you don't do the survey. So like Google reviews, those are all voluntary responses. Usually Google reviews are bad because only people that had a bad experience are inclined to complete the survey. Easy sampling, or the quickest sampling. So whatever's easiest or fastest or the least amount of work, it's called convenient sampling. So if it's not random, not stratified, not systematic, and not cluster, generally it's called convenience sampling. Like, you didn't really use an official method to take your sample, you just kind of did whatever you wanted. That's what we call convenience sampling. So this is not a good type of sampling. And then your book talks a little bit about multi-stage sampling. We're not going to get too much into multi-stage. This is for very large-scale surveys. And there's a very detailed example in your book. We don't really get into multi-stage. So if I'm trying to survey the entire United States, I might use several sampling methods to get through and collect a good sample. So there's a good example on page 33. I'm not going to try to explain it all here. It's just not worth our time. But it's just using simple and cluster and systematic and stratified and kind of different combinations when you have large populations to work with. So again, really these are the three we're focused on other than simple random. Convenience is when it's none of the ones we talked about, and then multi-stage is when it's a combination of all those techniques. Alright, so there is some examples at the top of page 9. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, read each scenario, and decide on the type of sampling. Is it simple random, stratified, cluster, or systematic? Or is it convenience? Is it none of those things? Is it a convenient sample, or is it a multi-stage sample? So pause the video, read the scenarios, jot down what you think the sampling method is for all 5 of those, and then you can play the video back to see how you did. Alright, the first one says to estimate the percentage of defect in a recent manufacturing batch, a quality control manager at Intel selects every 8th chip that comes off the assembly line, randomly starting with the 3rd chip until she obtains a sample of 140 chips. So the every 8th tells you that this is a systematic sample. So she randomly chooses a starting point, and then every 8th chip is sampled until she has her sample size of 140. So that gives it away that it's a systematic sample. The next one says to determine the prevalence of a human growth hormone use among high school varsity baseball players, the State Athletic Commission randomly selects 50 high schools. All members of the selected high school's varsity baseball team are tested for HGH. So you randomly select the high schools, that's the location, and the key word here is that all members at that high school are tested. So it is a cluster sample. The next one says a college official divides the student population into 5 classes: freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and graduate. So they're grouping by a certain characteristic. The official takes a simple random sample from each class and asks their opinion about student services. This is a stratified random sample, so dividing the population into homogeneous groups and then taking a random sample from each group. The fourth one says a survey regarding download time on a certain website is administered on the internet by a market research firm to anyone who would like to take it. kind of open, free-for-all, no certain methods being used. So it is a convenience sample. And finally, 24-Hour Fitness wants to administer a satisfaction survey to its current members. Using its membership roster, the club randomly selects 40 club members and asks them about their level of satisfaction with the club. So they have a roster, they have a frame, and they're randomly selecting from that roster. So that is a simple random sample. You list everybody and you randomly pick a few. So there'll be some homework questions where, again, it gives you a scenario and you decide which type of sampling method is it. If it's none of those, it's probably a convenience sample. Alright, so that's about sampling. Anytime we are doing sampling, there's a potential for bias in the sampling. Bias is when things are done unfairly. So bias means something was unfair. So we like to be fair in statistics. We like to take even, fair, no bias, no unfair, advantage or disadvantage. So there's several types of bias, and we're going to try to keep this brief. This can go on forever. Again, in graduate school, you'll learn more about bias and sampling. There's 3 main types of bias that we're going to study. And response bias, this last one has several different kind of subcategories within it. But sampling bias, non-response bias, and response bias are the 3 that we're going to focus on. Sampling bias, including what we call undercoverage, is when we use convenience sampling, so kind of lazy sampling, and that means that not everyone in the population had a fair chance to be selected. And this happens a lot, unfortunately. We forget about a certain part of the population. Especially if you've ever taken an evening class or a weekend class. I know I've taught evening and weekend classes. And if there's events on campus where students can win a free t-shirt or free this or free that or food or whatever it might be, they forget to offer those free things to the evening students or the weekend students. That's called undercoverage. So if there's a drawing to win something, but you didn't have a chance to put your name in, that's called undercoverage. You are not included, and you did not have a chance to be selected. So that's called sampling bias. The sampling method was unfair. Non-response bias is the second kind. This is when we have voluntary surveys and people who were selected do not respond. So I don't know if you guys are really good when you get a receipt survey and there's a survey at the bottom of the receipt and the cashier circles it and says, please go take our survey, and you're like, and you don't do it. That's non-response bias. So you were selected to participate and you chose not to. You volunteered that you were not going to participate. So that's called non-response, when you do not respond even though you were selected to participate. And then response bias is when the survey was not conducted properly. Something was wrong with the survey. So what happens is your response is influenced in some way. So you didn't necessarily give a true, honest, fair response because the survey was not conducted properly. There's several different ways this can occur. This is just a few examples of the different ways things can have response bias. The first way is called interviewer error, and that is when the interviewer influences your answers. So if you're filling out an evaluation for your friend who's a cashier, you might fudge your responses to make your friend look good or not good. Or like if an educator asks you about your study habits, you might fluff them up a little bit. If a police officer asks you about any sort of illegal activity like speeding, you might not be as honest. If you know, those kind of situations where you're probably mostly telling the truth, but you might fudge it a little depending on who the interviewer is. And then you have misrepresented answers, when you inflate or deflate your results. Whoop, can't spell. Results. If you ask a woman her weight, she might deflate her results. If you ask a gentleman how many push-ups he can do, he might inflate his results. So when you kind of fudge your results, those are misrepresented answers. The wording or order of the questions. Lawyers are really good at this. Phrasing. So the lawyer's phrasing. Think about how you ask the question and how that influences your answer. Salesmen do this as well. Salesmen will kind of word the questions in a way that influence your answers. The type of question you're being asked. Is it an open response question or a closed question? Right? So if you're allowed to respond with anything you want, you might answer one way. If it's a yes or no or multiple choice question, you might be forced to kind of answer differently. And then the last one is called data entry error. And that is when there's just a mistake when answering or entering data. So if I'm doing an online survey and I click 1 instead of 5 because I thought 1 was the best when 5 was the best, that's just a data entry error. Or if I have a handwritten survey and I'm trying to digitize it and put it in the computer, I might make a mistake in my data entry. So that's just kind of an honest mistake that changes your responses. So bias can be a little difficult to categorize, but it's almost always present, especially in observational studies. So we're going to practice this here in just a second. The video is going to cut off. I only have about 20 minutes per video before the time runs out. So I'm going to pause there. On the next video, we'll practice some examples of each type of bias.